really just excited for the growth, really excited for growth, and just learning stuff. And one of the things I'm going to talk today about was just like, a couple of things. I think one of them was definitely leadership. I mean, we both are leadership facilitators. I don't know if we probably recorded at this point, but just want to make sure people emphasize. I always know I forget this. Like subscribe and to this channel, like subscribe to it, because we definitely want to keep this stuff rolling. It's been going well, man. I'm excited to see the thousands of views we've accumulated. I'm excited to get to a point where we get to 10,000 and then to 50,000, then 100,000 of views. And another sidebar, I have someone now who's taking the reins of uploading the content and doing all that stuff. My virtual assistant knocked it out the park. I gave her a demo and gave her an example of what to do. And she came out with the graphic. She came out with the description. She came out with the tags. So now I made her the YouTube manager. And I'm like, I can't believe this. Like, this is something beautiful that someone else has this task that, and what I learned from that whole situation was, if you slow down enough, you will give yourself an opportunity to speed up. The slowing down was documenting. Like I had an index card with 10 steps for what I do to make every episode go up. And I had to slow down and write the 10 steps and then create a 20-minute video describing the 10 steps.
Right.
And then send it to the person to now have it no longer be a task of mine.
Right.
But you have to be willing to make the room for that by slowing down enough to document your process so that somebody can replicate it.
Totally. It's a common expression in sleight of hand magic. I mean, in leadership in general, but I first heard it in magic was slow down to speed up. If you don't break down the steps and really understand what's involved in what you're doing, you can't accelerate them, nor can you teach anybody else, nor can you delegate to anybody else what you need to get done. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And
wow.
Congrats on the assistant. That's great.
No, it's beautiful. It's gonna make life a lot easier.
I still can't believe that this has as many views as it's reaping. From what started, it's just such a small idea to record a conversation, just such an easy and accessible thing.
Right. Nah, it's crazy. And that's funny because that's what I wanted to talk about was just idea generation and what environments make those a lot easier to create. Like what things, I think there's some people who have too many ideas and there's some people who have no ideas at all. And for the emphasis of what we're talking about today, I would love to talk to the people who say, I don't have an idea, right? Because I feel like I hear more people who say, I don't know, or I have no idea versus the ones who do have a lot of ideas. So what would you say, or we could just throw it out into the middle of the ring about what does idea generation look like to you?
This is my bread and butter. I love this. I think it's so much about this stuff because for my own sake, I felt the decrease in my own creativity through school. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist. And I remember getting, feedback on stuff that just shut me down and prevented me from sharing any more of ideas, not just with respect to art or creativity specifically in creative fields, but even taking risks in a class and offering a perspective that wasn't I was always trying to give people what they wanted to hear rather than what I thought would be cool or interesting. And I got really good at doing that because I was playing for grades. And I think what I've learned is the biggest barrier to, I think what shuts people down from generating ideas is the fear of rejection, is the fear of judgment. We talked about this a bunch of times, but there's a study I love to reference, George Land and Barbara Jarman. Beth Jarman, sorry. George Land and Beth Jarman, I think it's like 1962 or 63. They partnered with NASA and they wanted to know if you could teach creativity as like a thing for astronauts. And so they did this study and looked at 3-year-olds. They gave these assessments to 3-year-olds, like hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And the results were overwhelming. Like 98% of 3-year-olds measure at the level of creative genius, which is mind-boggling. It means almost everybody who's ever lived was at one point a bona fide creative genius.
Wow.
Then they do the same, they follow up. This is what the study is so powerful. They do the same kids. So it's a longitudinal study. They get them again when they're 10 years old, and they give them the same assessments. And by the time they're 10, I think the number has dropped down to 30%. 30% are creative genius. At 15, 12% are creative genius. Now, they didn't get them at 25. They just tested a random bunch of 25-year-olds adults. But at adulthood, less than 2% measure creative genius. So there's something is happening to us that beats the creativity out of us. And I think Sir Ken Robinson talks about it in his TED Talk, how schools kill creativity. It's that schools teach us there's one right answer, and if you don't have it, you're wrong, and you should avoid being wrong at all costs. If that means biting your tongue and not sharing an idea, do it.
Right.
Don't take the risk and be rejected and create a reputation for yourself as a failure. Instead, tread cautiously and carefully, read the room and give people what they want to hear. And I learned how to play that game really well. And it wasn't until, when I dropped out of the med school path and I sort of stepped back and I just didn't care about results anymore, that I began to tap into the creativity more so. So when I hear people who are hesitant about coming up with ideas, I'm like, it's not true. I'll push back and say, you probably have ideas all the time. You just don't share them out loud, or you've already rejected them yourself. So to you, they don't even qualify as ideas. And if they don't qualify, if you don't define them as ideas, then they're nothing. Then they're nothing to you, and therefore you're not creative. So that's where I always begin with people is like, I share that study because I want people to see that they probably are already creative. And I want people to know that the biggest difference maker is their self-belief. As soon as you say, I can't, you just wrote your script. You just wrote your play. Self-fulfilling,
That's crazy. And so, that's an amazing study. There's two things came up to my mind when you were talking. I thought of when someone says they have no ideas, I think there's always like a hidden term or hidden something in there that they're not saying, or they heard the question different. So if I say, do you have an idea? They heard, do you have a good one? And because of that, they're like, well, I'm not sure. But since I'm not sure it's a good idea, I don't have any ideas. And so oftentimes we hear a question, someone says a question, but we hear it differently than what they said, right? So, totally. B-Love, you have an idea, and you may have heard good idea, and so you go, I don't have anything. And it's like, how is that possible that you have nothing? And it's like, but they're not able to convey and break it down to say, well, I have an idea, but I'm not sure if it's good. They won't say that part because there's a level of vulnerability that's attached to it. Like, I gotta now put you at the mercy of the court to tell you if it's a good idea or not. And it's like, I'm not sure, versus understanding. And I think if we can normalize the fact that, and this is something my mentor taught me, and I never really understood this until he showed it to me. He said, Geo, do you remember the project we did called whatever, just to save his, but I won't say the name, right?
Sure.
So do you remember this thing we created? And I'm like, yes, I do. He said, do you notice that we don't do that anymore? I said, I do notice we don't do that anymore. He said, well, I didn't do it because it didn't work, right? And I was blown away because I was blown away at how quickly he was able to move on, but also noticing how much work he put into it. I think it's easy to move on when you don't put anything into it.
Sure.
But when I hear a guy create a company, create a logo, get an LLC, create business structure for all this stuff, and then tells me a month later, didn't work. And then it didn't work and he's moping, it didn't work. I'm already in the middle of the next thing. And so one of the things he taught me was, he's like, Geo, my business that I've built, which is not a 7, 8 figure business,
Mm-hmm.
only was born out of the 10% of the ideas I had.
Mm-hmm.
So 90% of the ideas did not work.
Mm-hmm.
So then I asked $1 million question. Well, how did you find the 10%?
Mm-hmm.
And he would tell me I got through the 90.
That's
Right?
it, man.
Like
Yeah.
it's just like how did you find it? It's like, well, a lot of wrongs
Mm-hmm.
led me to a right.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if it's like every 100 wrongs maybe gives you a letter in the word right, right? So right has 5 letters. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe if every 100 wrongs you get a letter. And so it's almost like, well, 100 wrongs get you R.
Yeah.
Another 100 gets you I. And you keep going and you're like, 500 wrongs got me one right. But
Mm-hmm.
that one right has allowed me to build everything. And no one remembers, just like Thomas Edison,
Mm-hmm.
no one remembers the wrongs, they remember the rights. I
Mm-hmm.
don't remember how many times Kobe Bryant missed a game winning shot. We don't go and look up Thomas Edison in Wikipedia and it says, well, the guy who fell 10,000 times, right? They just call him inventor, right? The guy
Mm-hmm.
with the most patents in the world and stuff. And so I think what you said about the fear of rejection is so key. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, well, yes, not everybody comes out with these perfect ideas. Now, the other thing I would ask you, and just to see like what's your thoughts on this, is when, let's say someone says, okay, I hear you guys have a lot of ideas. Now, the part that I know I wrestle with, and I know some others do as well, is when do I let that idea out, right? Because there's a secret. Like, it's cool to have my ideas. It's protected, right? I'm quarantining them in a sense. They're not
Sure.
exposed.
Yeah. Yeah.
When but then there's like that there's a line where it's like it has to be exposed at some point. What allows you in any ideas you've ever had, what thought process you go through to cross the line from secret to public?
Mm-hmm. Oh, my head is like, the muscles are starting to hurt from nodding so much here, because yeah, you're touching on so many good things. I want to answer that question about that threshold.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to the misinterpretation of the question, do you have any ideas? And what we assume is the question is, do you have a good idea? Because, and it's true, because ever since we started asking the question, do you have any ideas? We're never really asking, do you have a bad idea? Like, that's never been a part of the
Yeah.
conversation, and it should
Yeah.
be, and it definitely should be. This is the thing, in Brain Sprouting, the book that Joel and I co-wrote, and
Yeah.
in our sessions we talk about human beings are really good at thinking in two different ways. We're naturally good at thinking in two different ways. We're naturally good at being creative, generating possibilities, making associations. Like anybody who's listening to this right now, I can guarantee that your brain is making associations unconsciously. You're not even trying, but everything that we say is triggering images, other thoughts, other words, and ideas. You can't help that. That's just the way the brain is. It's associative. So we have that biological creativity. And we also are really good at thinking critically. The other side of things, that's where we're judging and analyzing and comparing. And I think that's what we learn in school, and what school really wants us to get good at. It recognizes that not all ideas are made equal, and it wants us to know how to assess and evaluate ideas from each other. So we start comparing. Like one of the first English assignments we get is compare and contrast, and make a
Mm-hmm.
decision about which idea is better for you, right? So we have these two modes of thinking, and we're really good at both of them, but we're terrible at doing them at the same time. We can't both be creative and critical in the same moment, in the same wave. And yet that's what we try to do all the time. So when we ask people for an idea, or more overtly, when we say, come up with a good idea for this problem, everybody in the room sits in silence and they look at one another, waiting for somebody else to go first, because you've asked them to do two things at once. You're asking them to generate a possibility and then judge it to be good enough. And we can't find that threshold. We don't know if we're there. So I always say, and this is something we say in brain spreading, in the process of generating ideas, separate the two. If you're going to be creative, if you're trying to solve a problem, give yourself just a little bit of space and time to be
Mm-hmm.
generative, without judgment or without concern for quality. and then revisit the list you produce and consider which ones have any merit. Instead of saying, what should we do? First say, what could we do? Then say, what should we do? And that, just separating that alone, in my experience with people and clients I get to work with, is a huge game changer. So that being said, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think we need to change the way we approach ideas. We need to have bad ideas to get to good ones. We need to go through the 90% wrongs to build out the right. And if we embrace that, like, and model that for one another, it becomes normal. You know, and I think that's another part of it is we talk a lot about we're product biased in the world. We only see finished products. We don't see the work and the failed attempts leading up to it. So for me, I know that an idea is only, I know that I can't make a judgment of an idea. This is what I've learned. I might have a sense for, I might make a list of ideas for a project I want to do in my speaking business or with a show. And I'll go through my list afterwards and say, oh, this one's a winner. This is a good idea. But I know that, and I've only learned this from experience, I know that my assessment of its goodness is super limited and narrow and untested. And so the threshold for me is, although it in the beginning, it took me a lot more gusto, it took a lot more like a breath of air and an ounce of courage to do it. Now I think any idea that I think has any bit of potential, I immediately pick up the phone and I want feedback from somebody right away, to put it out from my mind to somebody else's and say, cut it to me straight. What do you think about this? Has this got any potential? Has it got, what's its biggest flaws? What do you suggest? And the sooner I get feedback, I might still think it's a good idea after I get feedback from you, for example, on this idea. But I might also have some really genuine areas of concern I'm going to want to consider before I go to the next step. And in design thinking, they call this rapid prototyping, which I know you're familiar with, but for people listening, rapid prototyping is you put an idea in a prototypical form into the world as soon as you can. Prototype doesn't mean you have to have a physical, model if you're thinking of a product. It just means you can answer like the 5 W's. What is this idea? Why is it important? Who are you targeting, or who is it going to affect? When are you going to do it? Where does it happen? If you have this in its basic structure, you now have a tangible thing. You can get to somebody else, get their feedback on it, and you take that input and you say, and not judgmentally, you take it, you incorporate it, you make your tweaks, and you go to someone else and you get more feedback on the new version. And then you get it back and you get more feedback, and you just go back and forth, iterating over and over again. And that's the only way anything has ever gotten better is by first getting feedback. And Apple's iPod is the example that's most famous and often referenced. I used to know the stats from presentations that I do on this, but I think it came out in 2002 or 1, the very first iPod. And by 2012, I think they're totally messing this up. Within like 15 years, there'd been 25 editions. Wow. And we know it now. The iPhone is like, part of it now is their marketing. They're making money every time they release a new phone.
Yeah.
But a large part of it is improving on the product, getting feedback from real customers who are using it and making those changes.
Yeah. I've heard their biggest budget within the company is the R&D department, right? So it's research and development.
I believe
and I think when you look at these companies that have big research and development, it's like, well, why are they growing? Is because they're constantly putting stuff out, researching, figuring out how to make it better. They're constantly living in that in that term of they're living in the room of improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing, and you're like, well, it's the biggest room in the world, like as one of my mentors said.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that's the biggest room in the world and you desire space, you should probably be in the same room, right? Because there's probably enough room for everyone in that room. And so I think that part of it is like, because when you said, hey, I just try to get this idea out of my head immediately, I think about, well, how did you, whether it's called tough skin or what's the shift in mindset that you made
Mm-hmm.
to not receive the feedback as criticism?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And I do acknowledge that in the beginning, and still, I mean, I don't always thrive on constructive criticism. You know, I still have the personal attachment to an idea. I think it's rock and roll. And somebody's like, you know, it just takes a little bit of like that. Don't even need a
Right.
word for it, right? But that
Yeah.
initial reaction when someone's not as excited about it as I am, like, oh, that kind of hurts. Um, but in the beginning, I think I needed to have a person just that would respect the space, that knows how to give feedback well.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've been lucky. I've had a few people that I really trust. If they're going to give me feedback, they're going to give me soft criticism. They're going to
Got
nestle it
it.
between two positive things or something, you know. And even I know I teach the sandwich model of constructive criticism. It's one of the first things people learn about in leadership. And if you've ever taught it, you know what it is. You recognize it instantly as
Yeah.
a technique, but it still works. You know, it's still effective. If someone like can pick out something they like about what I've got, and then they can offer me the bit that they'd change or that they suggest
Yeah.
was a little different, then I can say I'm a little more palatable that way.
That makes sense.
Palatable.
No, that's
Uh,
big. I think, and again, I like this whole idea because I think like, I just want to encourage people to have more of them, right? Just to have the space for them. The more
mm-hmm.
you have, the space to be able to like fail and to generate and to be like, oh snap, like wow, like this idea and that idea, and to have so many of them, it does create. There's so much of the feedback, like you said, that you get to go and make a better guess, to create a better idea to improve on it. And so I think that that's just a big thing when we think about like, um, even like the idea of making magic. You like think about it, and we think about the end product. We think about instantaneously something happens. We don't think about practice. We don't think about process. Any of that stuff. And so you're like, well, either I have it or I don't. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
um, how do you know? And ever since you shared this with me from the conference that I went to a few weeks back about the whole I'm onto something, like I've never forgotten it, right? Like
Yeah.
I've held on to, oh man, I'm onto something. I'm
Yeah.
onto
Yeah.
something. And I think sometimes like I believe every great thinker would be considered crazy or some type of alternate reality that they live in, right? So if you go and
Mm-hmm.
say, well, Steve Jobs told us that we would put 30,000 songs in our pocket, and you're like, no, that's not
Mm-hmm.
happening. And you
Right.
have that, right? And then you go and say, well, if I told people 25 years ago that the regular people would be your new cab drivers, you're going to get in their car, you're not going to exchange any money, and you're never going to have to tell them where you're going, and they're going to get you there with no problem. And they'll be like, I don't get it. Like we have map quests and directions on paper and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or forget hotels, you're going to start staying at people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not. It's like, well, then what is Airbnb? So like you start looking at all these things, and it's like, well, these were all once thought of as ideas that were crazy, bad ideas, if you want to go and label them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you said, and I want to make sure people remember it, is that that design thinking part of it with the prototype and just having the 5 Ws. It's like, instead of do you have something good, the question is, do you have something? And I think the framework of the 5 Ws allows you to have a minimal viable product that someone can provide feedback on. So by no means am I saying go and expose your infant child who didn't get no injections or none of the shots and say just put them out there in the world to go and catch something. By no means are we saying that, but we are saying that make sure you have something. And again, the basics of the 5 Ws is a great place to start.
Absolutely. One other thought I'll offer is I think Elizabeth Gilbert has a book called Big Magic, and she's the one who wrote Eat, Love, Eat, Pray, Love, I
Yep.
believe. and her book Big. I didn't read Eat, Pray, Love, mostly because by the time I'd heard about it, it was already such a cliche. But I'm sure it's great. And Big Magic is excellent. It's about her creative process, or her take on creativity, I think. And one of the things she suggests is that as humans, I mean, it's really hard to explain where ideas come from. When we teach creativity in my sessions, like the only answer we can land on is ideas come from other ideas. And it's really hard to trace back like the origin of ideas. It's hard to know where anything is born from. And for Elizabeth Gilbert, she says it's not, they're not ours. They come through us. They use us as a vehicle, but they have their own realm of where they dance and play, and then they decide to come in and zap somebody with an idea. And if that person is ready for it, they'll take action on it and put it into the world. And if not, they'll move on and find somebody else to live through. And I love that idea because it means we don't have to define ourselves by the ideas that we produce. Instead, ideas are just things that happen, and we get the chance to bear witness or not. And I think that the risk of putting an idea into the world and fearing rejection, or the reason it feels so risky, is because we feel like it's our idea and therefore a measure of who we are as a person. When, for me, if I shift it and say, here's an idea, I don't know if it's any good, and someone says, "No, actually, it's terrible," I'm like, huh, good thing I found out now, and I don't build more of my identity around it, like, because it doesn't matter. It's not me. It's just an idea. It's not who I am.
No, I love that. I love that. And a matter of fact, I want to make sure I download that book. I just love the idea of it's passing through us. I think that there's a book called Extreme Ownership, which is big on leadership stuff. I think the ownership part of it, I think that would alleviate a lot of the stress and anxiety people had around ideas if they realized that it wasn't yours.
Right.
Because if it's mine, then it's like I take it personal, right? So if I'm a teacher and 25 students are in my class and one student failed, it's not the same as if that one student was my child. Right.
Yep.
But if it's like the passing through aspect of it, it's like, wow, like, okay, it's a journey, and it may just not have been you weren't the one to conduct this one, right? Like this is just not your train.
That's
like, but another, and the beauty of it is that you just got to be present to notice when the idea is the one that you're supposed to conduct. You're supposed to drive home to take it to a specific destination.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that idea of, the idea is passing through. I think that's something that I think would be a great place to put a bow on, just the idea generation part of it. And, this is obviously a shorter episode than we've done before, but I'm interested to see how it's received, because it's a different length. But I think just the idea generation, hopefully everybody who's watching, if you got anything from this, just drop a comment about, what stood out to you. Maybe you may have your own way. Like, how do you deal with constructive criticism, or how do you try out ideas, or, anything you can share in terms of the idea generation side of it, I think would be super cool, just for the community aspect to go and learn from the collective.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where we've found our safe space, has been being in a community of others who are also trying to navigate this quote unquote space.
Yeah.
And so hopefully you guys will feel encouraged to do that with what B-Love shared. I think that study was super amazing in terms of where does the creativity genius go, which I just blows me away that it can go from that percentage at 3 years old to up to 12, then 25 to be like 2% or less. And it's like, hey, well, I want to be part of the 1%. And it's like, well, what if we just made sure the 1% of it never left you in the first place?
Yeah. Brilliant. I'd love to learn more too. So all ideas are welcome. I love to hear, and I'm always gaining in this regard. Like you say, we're all part of the same community. So please share ideas and strategies. I'm learning.
Perfect, man. Yeah, and subscribe, people. Subscribe
and like.
Subscribe and like and share it with your friends and stuff. Again, we love doing this. We will continue to put content out, but we hope that you would be able to share in that excitement that we often have when we get a chance to connect. And hopefully you will be able to do the same, create safe spaces like this to communicate with your friends and colleagues so that the creativity can continue to grow and hopefully change the world.
I love it so much. I love it so much. Hey, thanks so much, Geo. We'll see you
All right,
again in a
man. We'll
week.
talk, buddy. All
Take
righty.
care, buddy.
All right. Bye.
Later.